This is the Marching Revolution podcast.
Boots on the ground with a thunderous beat. Hearts in sync, our purpose complete. Map of the future drawn by our stride through the struggle.
Welcome back to the Marching Revolution podcast, where we like to really dive deep into the world of marching arts.
Absolutely.
And today, we're going to kind of tackle a topic that might surprise some people.
Yeah.
The potential downsides of drum corps intense culture.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not here to bash drum corps at all.
Yeah.
We love this activity.
Of course. Yeah.
But let's be real, the dedication and discipline that it requires can come with some hidden costs.
I think that's an important point to make, that, we often celebrate the achievements of high-pressure activities like drum corps without really examining the potential psychological impact on the individuals involved.
And we've got some pretty fascinating sources here that really shed light on this.
Yeah.
We have articles that compare drum corps culture to military training.
Okay.
And even cults.
Interesting.
I know it sounds intense.
It does. And it's crucial to approach this conversation with nuance.
Yeah.
We're not saying that drum corps are cults,
right,
but there are some thought-provoking parallels.
Yeah, especially when you look at the demand for absolute commitment.
Right.
The cultivation of a sense of higher purpose.
Okay.
And even the specific language used to shape members' thinking.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit.
Yeah, let's do it.
One article compares drum corps culture to Robert J. Lifton's 8 criteria for thought reform, which is essentially the psychological process of indoctrinating someone into a cult.
Wow.
And this article argues that drum corps actually exhibits several of these criteria.
Okay.
So pretty interesting stuff.
Interesting.
And one of the most striking parallels the article points out is the concept of sacred science.
Okay.
So that's where the core methods are presented as the only way to achieve excellence.
Right. And that's that kind of like our way is the right way mentality.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Don't reinvent the wheel.
Interesting.
You're not supposed to question the established methods, but does that stifle creativity and individual expression?
That's a really valid question.
Yeah. And it actually ties into another one of Lifton's criteria, which is loading the language.
Oh, wow.
Think about all the phrases that you constantly hear in drum corps, like buy-in.
Oh, yeah.
No excuses, push through the pain.
Yeah.
This language creates a very specific worldview, and it can be incredibly powerful in shaping how members think and behave.
Yeah, it's almost like its own dialect.
Right.
You've got to learn the lingo.
Exactly.
To fit in.
You got it.
But is it healthy to constantly encourage young people to push through pain?
That's the question.
Like, where do you draw the line?
That is a crucial question, and that's where we start to see some of the potential downsides of this high-control environment.
Okay.
One of the articles we have here actually lists 7 specific psychological impacts.
7?
Yes.
Wow, okay.
To watch out for.
So what are some of the biggest red flags that parents and members should be aware of?
Well, a big one is identity fusion. It's this idea that members merge their identity with the core.
Right.
To the point where their entire self-worth becomes wrapped up in their performance and their place within the group.
Yeah, so it's like their entire world revolves around drum corps.
Yeah.
I can see how that could make it really hard to transition back to normal life after this season ends.
Exactly. And it can make it really hard to develop a sense of identity outside of the corps, which is really crucial for long-term well-being.
Right. And that leads us to another one of those 7 impacts you mentioned, which is dissociation from pain.
Oh, yeah.
That whole pain is weakness leaving the body mentality.
Yeah, and while pushing your limits can be admirable, constantly ignoring physical and emotional distress can have some really serious consequences down the line. It can actually desensitize you to pain.
Right.
Making it hard to recognize your own limits and potentially leading to injuries or burnout.
It's like you're training your brain to ignore your body's natural warning signals.
Absolutely.
And I imagine that could also make it difficult to identify and address mental health struggles as well.
Absolutely. And that's a major concern because a lot of drum corps don't have adequate psychological support systems in place.
Wow. So it's like sending athletes to compete without proper medical care.
Yeah.
If we're asking these young people to push themselves to their limits, we have a responsibility to provide them with the resources they need to stay healthy, both physically and mentally.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's a real need for change in drum corps culture to protect the well-being of its members.
I couldn't agree more.
So the good news is that there are actionable steps that corps can take to create a healthier environment without sacrificing that pursuit of excellence.
Okay.
In fact, many of the top-tier drum corps are already leading the way in this area.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So the best corps are actually treating their members better.
They are. There's a noticeable difference in how these top groups approach member care.
Interesting.
And it's not just because they're nicer. It's because they often have the resources and infrastructure to prioritize well-being
Right.
in a way that some smaller corps might struggle to do.
So what are some of the things that these top corps are doing differently?
Okay.
Are there any specific examples we can point to?
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest differences is talent density.
Okay.
Top corps attract the best of the best, which means they can spend less time on like basic fundamentals
Right.
and more time refining the details.
Gotcha.
And that translates to less exhaustion, fewer overuse injuries right off the bat.
That makes sense. If everyone's already at a high skill level, you can focus on pushing those artistic boundaries instead of drilling the same technique over and over again.
Exactly. And that efficiency frees up time and energy for other things like proper recovery rest and individualized attention.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, let's not forget about funding.
Yeah.
Top-tier corps often have bigger budgets, allowing them to invest in things like professional athletic trainers, physical therapists, and even sports psychologists.
So they have the resources to treat their members like elite athletes, which they essentially are.
Right. They recognize that investing in their members' well-being ultimately leads to better performance.
Makes sense.
And a more positive experience for everyone.
Yeah.
And then another key factor is member retention.
Okay.
So because these top groups tend to have more returning members each year,
Right.
there's less pressure to constantly reteach technique to a brand new group of rookies.
Yeah.
That creates a more stable and supportive learning environment.
And I imagine that stability also helps with leadership development, right?
Absolutely.
The veteran members can mentor the rookies, and there's more continuity in terms of coaching style and expectations.
Absolutely. And those top corps often have more progressive leadership in general.
Okay.
They're adopting more like athlete-centered coaching methods,
No.
which means they're more likely to listen to member feedback, adjust their strategies, and create a more collaborative and respectful environment.
So it's a combination of factors, but it seems clear that those top groups are doing something right.
They are.
But what about the rest of the drum corps world?
Yeah.
What about those groups that maybe don't have the same resources or talent pool?
Right.
Do they just have to accept a lower standard of care?
That's a really critical question, and it's concerning because some research suggests that the gap between the top corps and the struggling corps is widening.
Oh, wow. So it almost sounds like a two-tiered system where the elite groups are enjoying these progressive practices while others are kind of stuck in the past.
And that can have real consequences.
Yeah.
Many mid and lower tier corps are still relying on those outdated high control methods, clinging to that toughness culture and thinking that grueling rehearsals will automatically equal better results.
It's easy to fall into that trap of no pain, no gain. But it sounds like that mentality might actually be holding some corps back.
Right. The research actually shows that approach is often counterproductive.
Really?
It leads to burnout injuries and psychological damage without necessarily translating to improved performance.
So what's the solution?
Okay.
How do we bridge that gap and make these better practices the standard across all levels of drum corps?
Right.
Seems like a pretty daunting task.
It is a big undertaking, but it's about shifting the mindset.
Okay.
Instead of viewing these improvements as extra or optional, we need to recognize them as essential components of any high-performing organization.
Right. You wouldn't send a marching band out on tour without instruments, so why would you send them out without proper support for their mental and physical health?
Exactly.
It just doesn't make sense.
And one of the most powerful ways to create change is through accountability.
Right.
One article we have here suggests establishing an independent ethics committee for drum corps.
Interesting.
It would be a third-party group that could review complaints, investigate potential abuses, and ensure that safety protocols are being followed.
That's a really interesting idea. Like having an external auditor come in and make sure everything is running smoothly.
Yeah.
You would add a layer of oversight that might be missing right now.
Right. They also suggest that corps should be required to publicly report data on things like injury rates,
Okay.
mental health support usage, and member retention.
Wow.
That level of transparency would be huge.
It would shine a light on what's really happening within these organizations.
Right.
Right now, it can be difficult to get a clear picture.
Yeah.
And that lack of transparency allows harmful practices to continue unchecked.
It also makes it hard for potential members and their families to make informed decisions.
Right.
If you knew a particular corps had a high rate of injuries or a history of mental health issues among its members, you might think twice before joining.
Transparency is so important.
It is.
But it's not enough on its own. We also need to empower members to speak up and advocate for themselves.
Yes.
But that can be tough in a culture that emphasizes obedience and discourages questioning authority, right?
It can be very difficult, but one of the articles suggests creating anonymous reporting systems where members can report misconduct, safety concerns, or even just share their struggles without fear of retaliation.
That's such an important step right now.
Right.
Many members might feel like they have nowhere to turn if they're experiencing something difficult or witnessing something that feels wrong.
And that silence can be incredibly damaging.
Yeah.
It allows problems to fester and can even create a sense of complicity.
Right.
But by creating these safe channels for communication, we can start to shift the culture from one of fear and silence to one of openness and support.
It sounds like we need a cultural overhaul, not just a few tweaks here and there.
Yeah.
But how do we actually change the way people think and talk about the drum corps experience?
Well, one article suggests starting with the language we use.
Okay.
We need to move away from phrases that glorify suffering and normalize pain.
Right.
Instead of saying things like, if you're not bleeding, you're not working hard enough, we need to encourage a more balanced and healthy approach.
Yeah, I think we've all heard those sayings, and they're so ingrained in the culture.
They are.
Remember that phrase we talked about earlier, pain is weakness leaving the body?
Oh, yeah.
It's time to retire that one for good.
I completely agree. It's a catchy phrase, but it sends a very dangerous message.
Yeah.
We need to replace it with language that emphasizes resilience, recovery, and self-care.
So instead of pushing through pain, we should be celebrating taking care of yourself so you can perform at your best without risking long-term damage.
Exactly. And that shift in language needs to be accompanied by a shift in coaching style.
Okay.
Instead of the traditional my way or the highway approach, we need to encourage more collaboration and communication between staff and members.
So more of a partnership than a dictatorship.
Precisely. Imagine a drum corps environment where the staff viewed the members as assets to be nurtured and supported rather than soldiers to be commanded and controlled.
That would be a huge change.
It would be.
But I think it would be a welcome one for a lot of people.
I think so too, and it would ultimately benefit everyone involved.
Right.
When members feel safe, respected, and supported, they're more likely to thrive both individually and as a group.
And that in turn can lead to better performances, greater creativity, and a more positive and sustainable culture overall.
Right. It's about recognizing that achieving excellence doesn't require suffering.
Yeah.
In fact, the best results often come when we prioritize well-being and create an environment where everyone feels empowered to perform at their highest potential without sacrificing their physical or mental health.
Well said. This has been an incredibly eye-opening conversation. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the potential downsides of drum corps culture to the concrete steps that can be taken to create a healthier and more supportive environment.
I agree. It's been a fascinating discussion.
We'll be back in just a moment to wrap up our deep dive and explore what all of this means for the future of marching arts.
Okay. Sounds good.
Stay tuned.
All right, so we're back now for the final part of our deep dive into the complexities of drum corps culture.
Yeah. We've talked about the potential downsides. We've talked about the psychological impacts.
Right.
And some potential solutions.
Mm-hmm.
You know what's really struck me throughout this whole conversation is how much of what we've discussed applies to other areas of life.
Oh, absolutely. Like this pressure to conform.
Yeah.
The glorification of pushing yourself beyond your limits.
Right.
The idea that suffering is necessary for success.
Yeah.
We see it in elite sports, certain academic programs, even some workplaces.
That's a really good point. It's like those high control dynamics we've been talking about aren't limited to just drum corps. They can pop up in any environment where there's this intense pressure to achieve.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from this whole deep dive is recognizing that these patterns of behavior and cultural norms don't exist in a vacuum.
Yeah.
They're part of a larger societal conversation.
So even if you've never marched drum corps or even seen a show, this conversation could still be relevant to you.
Wow. We've all experienced that pressure to conform, to push ourselves beyond our limits to sacrifice our well-being for some perceived greater good.
Yeah.
And it's important to step back and ask ourselves, is this healthy? Is this sustainable? Am I truly thriving, or am I just surviving?
Those are some heavy questions, but I think they're worth asking.
Yeah.
Makes me wonder, if we can start to change the culture in drum corps, could that have a ripple effect?
Wow.
On other areas of society, could it be a catalyst for broader conversations about mental health, work-life balance?
Thank you for
creating
listening to
healthier
the Marching
environments overall?
Revolution
It's an interesting
podcast.
thought, isn't it? What if drum corps could become a model for how to achieve excellence without sacrificing well-being?
Right.
Imagine if we could export those values and practices to other fields.
It's like that saying, be the change you wish to see in the world.
Yes.
If drum corps can evolve and become a healthier, more supportive environment, it could inspire others to do the same.
Exactly. And I think that's a hopeful note to end on.
Yeah.
We've uncovered some uncomfortable truths about drum corps culture today, but we've also seen that change is possible.
Yeah, we've seen that there are people within the activity pushing for reform, advocating for a better way.
Yes.
And we've talked about some concrete solutions that can be implemented to make drum corps a healthier, more supportive environment for everyone involved.
I love that. And those solutions can serve as a blueprint for change in other areas of life as well.
Absolutely.
So as you go about your day, as you encounter those moments of pressure, those demands to conform, those situations that make you question your own well-being, remember what we talked about today.
Remember that you have the power to choose a different path to advocate for yourself and others.
Yes.
And to create a world where excellence and well-being go hand in hand.
Well said. It's been a pleasure diving into this topic with you.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of drum corps.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.
If you enjoyed this exploration of the marching arts, be sure to subscribe to the Marching Revolution podcast for more insightful discussions.
Yes, definitely subscribe.
Until next time.
Boots on the ground with a thunderous beat. Hearts in sync, our purpose complete. Map of the future drawn by our stride. Through the struggle we walk unified. Marching forward.